Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. With just over 2 weeks to go for the budget, we present the first in a series of interviews about the state of the economy and the steps the finance minister is well advised to take. My first guest is the managing director of Kotak Mahindra Asset Management and a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Nilesh Shah. Mr. Shah, let's start with the state of the economy. GST collections, foreign exchange reserves, and power consumption are at an all-time high. Side by side, passenger vehicle sales, railway freight, and the PMI index also show strong recovery. Is this a sign that the worst is behind us, or could these results be one-sided, misleading, perhaps even exaggerated?
No, I think worst is firmly behind us. It's not only GST collection, but also e-way bills, which are up 16%. That means this recovery is broad-based. It's not only power consumption, but also FASTag collections and Google Mobility Index, which are at all-time high level, which shows economies returning to normalcy. So we can definitely say that worst is behind us. Businessmen and entrepreneurs are getting more confident about future as reflected in PMI.
That's very interesting. Let me then, before I proceed, put to you a few areas of great concern. I'll go through them one by one. To begin with, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy has reported that as of the end of December, employment had fallen by 14.7 million, and the unemployment rate for that month was 9.1. Private surveys, as you know, are actually showing employment falling by 18 million. Side by side, the figures put forward by NREGA say that up to the 10th of January, 10 crore people had availed of this facility, an increase of 21% over the previous year. So would you accept that unemployment, joblessness in particular, is a major concern still?
Undoubtedly, unemployment is a major concern. And more importantly, it's not just the job, it is also the income level which remains a concern for us. Now, fortunately, month on month, there is improvement. If we go by CMI's latest data for 3rd January, unemployment level is now 7.4% compared to previous week's 8%. Rural unemployment is down to 7.1% below national average, and urban unemployment remains slightly higher at 7.9%. I think eventually we need to shift 10 to 15 crore people from agriculture to manufacturing and services. We created lots of jobs in IT, BPO, KPO by becoming back office to the world. Now we have to become manufacturer to the world to remove this problem of unemployment.
Let me just, for the sake of the audience, point out that the unemployment figures you quoted a moment ago are CMIE's weekly ones. When I said the unemployment in December was 9.1%, that was the monthly figure.
Monthly number.
There's no real discrepancy between the two. A second area of concern seems to be the financial sector. The latest financial stability report put out by the Reserve Bank of India shows that NPAs for all banks could shoot up to 13.5% by September 2021 compared to just 7.5% a year earlier. But if you look at NPAs for public sector banks, PSU banks, then in fact the NPAs could shoot up to 16.2% compared to 9.7% a year earlier. Would you accept the financial sector does have serious problems at the moment?
Undoubtedly, the NPA burden on financial sector is a cause of concern. However, compared to past cycle, this time banks are provisioning for the NPAs. The provisioning coverage ratio is fairly high. But the real problem for us is resolution of NPAs. In essence, there are two models for us. One is Satyam model, where IT major talked about misgovernance, and then quickly government came down and ensured that it was resolved in a manner where employees' jobs were protected, IT industry's reputation was protected, shareholders eventually benefited, though in the short term they did suffer losses. Net net, it was a win-win for employees, government, IT industry, shareholders, lenders, everyone. On the other hand, we also have security scam. Now people have become familiar with courtesy scam 92. The cases are still going on. Assets are still blocked. There's no resolution. I think we need to learn from US, where their largest company, General Motors, was put into bankruptcy during 2008 subprime crisis. And 6 months it was resolved and it was back on its feet. We can't be dragging our NPS for years and years.
Are you suggesting that the sort of policy the United States followed with regard to GM is the sort of policy we should follow with regard to NPAs in India?
Undoubtedly, it's not the extent of NPS which is an issue, because in most of cases NPS are backed by assets. Those assets, if not monetized appropriately and fast, then they decays and create bigger NPS.
In other words, decision to put the Bankruptcy Act into suspension for a while, you think is a mistake?
Maybe at that point of time it was necessary, but now we need to bring it back and ensure that IBC actually works on ground. Earlier spirit of IBC was that in 180 days we'll create resolution. On an average, IBC has taken more than a year to create resolution.
A third area of concern arises from different sectors of the economy. I know that large private companies have made fairly substantial profits because they've reduced wages and they've reduced inputs. But there are other sectors that seem to be suffering sometimes pretty badly. For instance, there are MSMEs which represent pretty close to 30% of GDP and 45% of manufacturing. There's the construction sector, which is the second biggest employer. And then, of course, there are sectors where contact is unavoidable, like hospitality, tourism, restaurants, hotels. Would you accept that these are sectors that bore the brunt of the lockdown and need special attention today?
Undoubtedly, construction, tourism, MSME need special attention and stimulus. But fortunately for us, there is some silver lining among the dark clouds. For example, on an average, 2 crore plus Indians travel abroad. Hopefully, from here onwards, they will be traveling less. Now, can we tap that potential for domestic tourism? It's not going to be easy, but we have to make a serious effort in that. On construction sector, stars are aligned for revival. At one point of time, construction sector used to contribute about 15% of GDP. Today, it is about 6% of GDP. Now, stars are aligned for this 6% to go up. You can get housing loan at 6.75%. Many states are not able to borrow at this rate. So it's an amazingly low interest rates. Affordability index of housing, which was 50 in 2014, is now down to 27 in 2021. And affordability improving will definitely create demand for real estate. Real estate units in top 7 cities in 2021 calendar year should be almost double that of previous year. More importantly, as interest rates have come down, rental yield looks attractive. So there will be investor demand. And state governments are giving stamp duty cuts. Put all these things together, can construction sector be revived? Answer is yes. Do we need to provide them some support? Definitely, this will accelerate the growth of construction sector. On MSME sector, again, we are in a tough spot, but there are some signing examples. For example, tiles industry in Morbi. Earlier, they were thriving by not paying taxes, by using diesel and other, material for firing their factories. Eventually, by court order, they had to shift to less polluting LPG and CNG. And because of gas-based production, it was easy to estimate what production they were making. And finally, they became tax compliant. As they became tax compliant, as they moved from unorganized to organized, the industry started growing. Today, Morbi tiles industry is exporting about 4,000 crore worth of tiles. So the successful model of MSMEs is Morbi Tiles, Tirupur Knit Industries. I think that's the future for MSME sector.
You've spoken about successful models of the MSME sector that other MSMEs should try and emulate. But there is a sense in which the crisis afflicting MSMEs links up with the crisis afflicting the financial sector. A lot of MSMEs have benefited from loans that were given. A moratorium has applied. That moratorium is about to end. I imagine many of those loans will convert straight into NPAs. And in addition, there are also the Mudra loans, which could also add to the NPAs. Isn't there a sort of linkage between the crisis that afflicts MSMEs and the crisis that looms on the horizon, particularly for public sector banks?
Undoubtedly, MSME sectors have bear the brunt of COVID-19 and they need support, they need stimulus. But at the end of the day, we just can't be throwing good money after bad money. We have to reinvent MSMEs in a way that they become competitive, they become efficient. And one more silver lining among the dark cloud is reduction in trade deficit with China. Over the years, we converted our manufacturers, especially in MSME, to traders as we started importing large quantum of goods from China. At peak, our trade deficit with China was $60 billion officially. And if we include routing of goods from other countries, probably it was $75 billion. Now, this year, it is expected to be around $35 billion. That's a great reduction. There are certain items which we have to import from China. We don't have a choice. But there are many items which we can make in our MSMEs. So we have to give support to MSMEs so that they can reinvent themselves, like Morbi tiles industry, like Tirupur knit industry.
Now, there are also one or two concerns that arise out of the recently released Q2 results. I noticed that consumption levels, investment levels are still sizably below what they were pre-COVID. And not so long ago, the former chief statistician Pranav Sen, in an interview to me, said he was becoming very concerned that if the situation in terms of investment isn't corrected, India in the next financial year could possibly face an investment-led crisis. Do you share that concern?
So if we go by the data on gross capital formation, in 2012, the household capex was about 16% of GDP. In 2020, that has fallen to 11%. That's a 5% reduction. On the other hand, corporates and government put together were 18% of GDP in 2012. They have come down to 17%, a marginal decline of 1%. Obviously, corporates have invested less, government has invested more. But at the end of the day, the decline in gross capital formation is driven by households, which is essentially a reflection of their investments in real estate by and large. Now, as construction sector revives with low interest rates, high liquidity and demand, hopefully this gross capital formation will reverse. At this capacity utilization, which is roughly 70 to 75%, it will be futile to assume that private sector investments will take a lead. We'll have to ensure that we support economy from a growth point of view, capacity utilization inches up, and then eventually private sector will start making investments.
But your main hope, therefore, is that in the construction sector will invite more investment by households, and household investment will make up the 5% reduction you referred to. In other words, you're also banking on individual consumption growing.
Absolutely. Our growth in the initial stages will be driven by consumption and household investments. And that growth, when increases capacity utilization, will ensure that corporate starts investing.
One last concern before I ask you, against this background, what the finance minister should do. And this last concern is the uncertainty of COVID. I know as we speak, our cases and our deaths are dramatically down, and that is very reassuring. But it's also true that as we speak, Europe and America are going through their second or third spike, and those spikes are considerably worse than the first. So can we be confident that India won't experience a second spike? Because if India does experience a second spike, we could find ourselves pushed back into lockdown, and that could reverse or retard whatever economic recovery you see on the horizon. So, how worried are you about the uncertainty of COVID?
So undoubtedly, as investors, we are constantly looking at COVID-19 situation. And as you correctly mentioned, we can't afford second wave of infection. What is happening in UK, US is hurting their economy and forcing their governments to give another large stimulus on top of what they have already provided. So we just have to pray to the God and pray to the citizens that they continue to maintain their vigil so that we don't get second wave of infection.
So, this is a moment where, as far as COVID is concerned, puja is as efficacious as anything else. Let me then, at this point, Mr. Shah, ask you, against the background of our discussion, where we've spelled out the state of the economy and the challenges and the concerns, what are the key steps you believe the finance minister should take just over 2 weeks from today when she announces the budget?
I will expect finance minister to create a growth supportive budget, raise revenue, don't raise taxes, spend money to accelerate growth by supporting needy sectors of economy, and maintain the path of fiscal prudence to reassure investors about India's commitment to fiscal prudence. These are all difficult objectives, but they are achievable.
Are there specific measures you'd like to see?
Yes. So in the first half of fiscal year 21, government actually spent more or less the same amount of money which it spent in previous year. And that was understandable because our revenues had shrunk quite considerably. So our effort should be on raising revenue. Now our tax rate on personal taxation side is already at the higher end. And we have seen that when you increase taxes, it does not necessarily reflect into tax collection. At one point of time, India's maximum marginal rate of tax was 97%, but tax to GDP ratio was substantially lower than today. So we need to raise resources. If we raise resources, we'll be able to fund everything. Now, there are a couple of great advantages India has. In last 21 years, we have imported 373 billion of gold on a net basis.
What
If
was
we
that
take
figure,
into
sir? I'm interrupting. 373?
$373 billion in just 21 years. And if we take into account gold smuggling and jewelry, which is worn by travelers, especially returning from Middle East, this number could be $500 billion. Now, this savings, unfortunately, is lying in Tijori, mostly in black account. Now, how do I unfreeze this savings locked in black economy to bring it into white economy? A gold amnesty scheme will bring taxes to the government. It will provide equity capital to business entrepreneurs, and it will create growth momentum for the economy. An appropriately designed and marketed gold amnesty scheme can raise lots of resources for the government. The second thing is related to strategic divestment of PSUs. Now, in 2008 January, PSU index reached a peak. And I did this data sometime back, about a month back. It is down 48% from Jan 2008 peak. In the same period, Sensex is up more than 2 times. Undoubtedly, PSU stocks have been derated like anything. The whole PSU basket trades below book, and our book value is historical, not market value. Clearly, if we pursue path of strategic divestment in PSUs, this PSU stocks can be re-rated. To give you a small example, in 2003, we divested 45% of Hindustan Zinc for 769 crore. Today, the residual 30% holding of government is valued at more than 30,000 crore. That is the potential of PSUs when their assets are utilized properly. Can we monetize our PSUs through strategic divestment route, through public-private partnership, so that the residual holding of government in PSUs, which is roughly about 7 to 8 lakh crore, can multiply many times. The third thing is
stop you there.
yeah.
When you talk about strategic divestment of PSUs, I take it you're actually talking about straightforward privatization.
A privatization in the format of Hindustan Zinc or Maruti Suzuki, where managerial control goes to private party, but some amount of stake is held by government, so that when company reaches its peak, it can be monetized even at a much higher prices.
But when you say some stake is held by government, is that a minority stake or over 50%?
No, it has to be minority stake, otherwise manager control will never shift into a private party.
Secondly, are you including in this strategic divestment, which is now actually privatization, public sector banks, or are you excluding them?
We should monetize public sector banks also. In fact, one big mistake of our divestment is that when Air India was 100% monopoly of aviation sector, we could have got far bigger value for Air India than today when it is a minority share in aviation sector. We should divest our PSUs when they are at peak rather than when they are at bottom.
Now, the finance minister did talk about the strategy for privatizing, fairly similar to what you're talking about in May. Unfortunately, 7 months have gone by and no step has been taken to actually initiate what she spoke about. I know there is some talk about starting the privatization of Air India, but who knows how quickly that will complete. Do you believe there is the political will in the government?
So there are multiple factors. One could be political side, other could be that we are viewing PSUs as family silver jewels, and there is generally resistance in Indians as a society to sell family silver jewels unless until there is a crisis. A person is not going to sell uh, his gold jewelry or silver jewelry unless until family is in crisis. So somewhere we have to open up our minds and see how Hindustan Zinc, Maruti Suzuki created value for government of India, for people of India through public-private partnership.
In other words, you're saying also stop thinking of PSUs as family silver. Get that mental attitude out of the way. It's a psychological block towards taking rational, sensible decisions.
Absolutely. And I will go even one step further. I'm not recommending that we should stop creating PSUs. We should keep on creating PSUs, but also keep on monetizing them. Today, our UPI, our RuPay, our Aadhaar, our Bheem, they are all global standards of excellence. Why not even monetize them?
Absolutely. Let the government get into the business of creating good ventures, which, when they succeed, can be sold to the private and government can make money and revenue out of the venture. In other words, the government becomes a bit like a business operator, create a good venture, make it succeed and sell it.
Absolutely. Government should be the largest private equity investor in the country.
Now, you were talking about other ways of raising revenue without raising taxes. You mentioned the gold amnesty scheme. You mentioned strategic divestment of PSUs. I know you have one or two more such ideas. Why don't you spell them out?
So the third thing is asset monetization of government. Our government is asset rich and liquidity poor. We have a lot of assets under, let's say, obscure act called custodian of enemy property. Now, India and Pakistan created this custodian of enemy property at the same time in the late 60s. Pakistan sold off all enemy property in 1971. After 49 years behind them, we still are left with 9,000 real estate valued at more than 1 lakh crore. And it probably includes an iconic property like Jinnah House in Mumbai. Why not monetize them? This is the best time. It's not easy. There will be title challenges. But if government can't resolve it, who will be able to resolve it? There is defense land, there is railway land. Can we monetize that? Sale and leaseback of some of the assets will be possible in today's world where pension investors are looking for a yield. So there is a huge opportunity to raise revenue at very, very attractive rate by monetizing government's assets.
You made a
Finally, I would also
just one little point before you go further, Mr. Shah. You made a very interesting point. You pointed out that Pakistan had monetized and sold off the property that it controlled as custodian of enemy property. India, on the other hand, is still sitting on 1 lakh crore of so-called enemy property, which we have failed to sell. In other words, Pakistan has beaten us to this particular game.
by 49 years.
That's a
And
huge
this
loss.
1 lakh crore is 2016 or 2014 estimate. I'm sure property prices would have appreciated in last 4 or 6 years.
You also, I believe that the time has come for the government to legalize betting and gambling. This could be a huge source of revenue. It is for Western countries. They make a lot of money out of legal, legitimate gambling, and it serves two purposes. Not only does it raise revenue for the government, it also ensures that there are non-corrupt, clean ways for honest citizens to legitimately bet and gamble. It serves both purposes. Spell this idea out a bit.
So if we look at Macau, Las Vegas, Atlantis, Singapore, Nepal, a lot of Indians are gambling over there. Betting, we all hear about IPL betting and election betting and so on and so forth. Today, these are underground activities supporting criminals. Why not we bring them overboard and create responsible industry? This will create employment, this will bring taxes to the government, and this will ensure that people don't go and spend this money abroad. Uh, Legalizing gambling, betting can create a viable industry, creating employment and bringing revenue to the government and undercutting funding to the criminal activities. I want to give example of Kerala lottery. Kerala gets about 80% plus of their non-tax revenue from profits of lottery business. It's a 15,000 crore industry based on March 18 number. And if it was a listed company, Kerala Lottery will be top 50 profitable companies in India. So in one state, they have taken advantage of people's liking for lottery and created fantastic industry. Why not replicate the same across India?
You've spelled out some very innovative, creative, and I would say imaginative ways of raising resources without increasing taxes. And certainly these are measures the government should think about. You are, as I said in the introduction, a member of the Prime Minister's Economically Advisory Council, although I know you're speaking to me today in your individual capacity. But is the government willing to hear this sort of advice? It's very new and novel. Sometimes governments tend to be very conservative and risk averse. So is this government open to these clever, innovative ideas?
Undoubtedly, they are open for ideas. I have written about this in public domain. I have shared this in my capacity as member ESC PM. And I just want to put one more point that we have to plug tax loopholes. Uh, there is a large fake cigarette, smuggled cigarette racket going on. Now, this needs to be plugged because tobacco does contribute a substantial portion of tax revenue. In financial industry, people have converted their capital, their interest income, which gets taxed at 43%, to long-term capital gain by an instrument called listed zero coupon debenture. Now, this is a cottage industry. People converting their capital gains taxable at 43%, interest income taxable at 43% to long-term capital gain taxable at 10%. Now, such loopholes needs to be bridged. If I was finance minister, I will invite top 10 chartered accounts of the country and request them to draft rules so that all the tax loopholes can be plugged.
Now, you spelled out in great detail, Mr. Shah, how the government can raise revenue without raising taxes. And you say the government is open to considering these innovative and new ideas. What is it that the finance minister should do with the money she raises? What are the schemes? What are the policies she should be spending money on?
So one, we have to obviously support bottom of the pyramid. Manrega, as you have mentioned, there were higher demand compared to pre-COVID days. So continue to support bottom of the pyramid so that the burnt of COVID-19 is lessened to the extent possible.
Can I interrupt and
Second,
ask? Are you
yeah,
talking about cash handouts to a particular section? direct benefit transfers as was done at the very early stages of the lockdown?
Obviously, that's one way of transferring money in the hands of needy. There will be multiple other ways. It could be related to food security, it could be related to employment through Manrega, it could be related to healthcare, which will ensure that we create a healthy society. So whatever is appropriate, India is such a large country that one size fits solutions will not work. But at the end of the day, if bottom of the pyramid society is rewarded properly, incentivized properly, we will get a sustainable growth. We will get a growth which is accelerating at a faster pace. Whatever is given to them, they are most likely to consume. Whereas if you give incentive to the top end of the society, they are more likely to save.
What about investment in infrastructure? What about in rural roads, bridges, and that sort of thing? Usually, those are also measures governments take when they want to push up investment, create employment, and put money in. The only problem is that the gestation period in India for infrastructure projects means that you may agree to do it today, but it doesn't start happening sometimes for 6 months or 8 months or 9 months.
So investment in infrastructure is a remedy for every crisis. From Keynesian days, it has been talked about in economy. But I will request government to consider Konkan Railway Corporation model or Delhi Metro model or Delhi Airport model. In Delhi Metro as well as Delhi Airport, because we had Commonwealth Games on our hand, the entire machinery came together to execute things at a faster pace. In Konkan Railway, since there was administrative freedom to Mr. Sridharan, he could complete an engineering marvel in a record time. By and large, government's spending on infrastructure gets delayed for variety of reasons. If we can create models like Delhi Metro, Delhi Airport, and Konkan Railway Corporation, then spending on this infrastructure will create immediate benefits and far bigger multiplier effect.
So you're saying that whatever the government chooses to spend on infrastructure as a way of boosting investment should be done by emulating models like the Delhi Metro, Konkan Railway, and Delhi Airport. These are basically
Absolutely.
private-public partnerships where the private element ensured that the money was invested quickly, the corruption was limited, and the result was soon delivered.
Absolutely.
But coming to the end of this interview, let me talk to you about something else. The government is very keen and is certainly trying to do its best to invite to India investment that it believes is leaving China. So far, the majority of such investment has actually gone to Vietnam and Bangladesh. But there are also reports that a lot of American companies that thought of leaving China may not be leaving as quickly or may not be leaving entirely. That said and done, do you believe that the things that you've spelt out will encourage more investment to leave China and come to India?
So this is a test match. It's not a T20. This is an opportunity of a lifetime. And like when we started doing Y2K in 2000, Indian IT companies were getting much smaller contract. But we kept on nibbling on that consistently. We kept on delivering best result. And eventually we have created multi-billion-dollar corporations. So IT industry didn't reach current level overnight. It's a 20-25 year journey. The same thing we have to do in getting industry out of China. Now there are some beautiful examples. For example, Vestas, a turbine maker, when it came to India, they said, look, in China, we set up our factory in 18 months. In India, actually, they completed in 15 months. We should request Vestas to go and probably talk about this in the global market so that other entrepreneurs, other industries, gets motivated. Samsung is another ambassador for India. They have already shifted their mobile handset plants from China to India. They are thinking of shifting high-end color television to India. The world's largest mobile handset is operated in Noida. Now, these are all the incidences which we have to highlight more often in the global markets so that investors and entrepreneurs feel comfortable coming to India. One good thing which government has done is production linked incentive scheme. Earlier, we had launched Textile Upgradation Fund to make India a global textile hub. In that scheme, we gave incentive for setting up factories. While there were some honest entrepreneurs who took advantage of that concessional financing, by and large, many entrepreneurs gold plated their plant and eventually it became NPA. Now, production linked incentive schemes is giving incentives for producing. It's giving incentive for producing across textiles, automobiles, mobile phones, electronics. We think this is a game changer. If we execute that well on ground, it is structured well, but it needs to be executed on ground. And it requires wholehearted support not only from central government, but also state government and also local authorities. Because even one component in this system which doesn't work efficiently will create its own disturbance, will create its own noise. So if we can execute this PLI scheme on ground, I think we will be able to create a lot of companies from China to India.
You mentioned the example of Vestas, you mentioned the example of Samsung, both of whom have moved a substantial amount of investment from China to India. But there are a lot of other companies who may want to do the same, but are a bit concerned about things like retrospective taxation, black tape and bureaucratic control, the slow judicial system, the difficulty in land acquisition and labor laws, and the fact that India is a federal system where states often have different policies and laws compared to the center. Now, I know that the government is trying to tackle some of these. It's begun to tackle labor laws in particular. But is it doing so sufficiently, and is it doing so speedily enough? Even in terms of labor laws, the concession has only been given for people who employ up to 300. Surely, if we want to get Chinese-style manufacturing going, as Swaminathan Iyer keeps writing, we need to give this concession to companies that employ 10 or 20,000, not cut off at 300.
So clearly, we need to do a lot. We have done a lot, but others are also improving. So in terms of land acquisition, I think if government starts delivering land, acquisition should not be an issue. On the labor laws side, if we can't create flexible labor laws all over the country, can we create it in pockets of SEZs where our labor laws will not be applicable? In terms of retrospective taxation, it's a one-off event which has happened. But now, can we ensure that the advantage of 25% taxation for corporate is advertised? So there are continuous ways of improvement which is required to bring entrepreneurs from abroad to India.
Can I pick up on that point you made about retrospective taxation? You said it was a one-off event, suggesting that it's not likely to happen again. But in fact, as you know, the government recently lost two fairly major arbitration proceedings, one to do with Vodafone, the other to do with Care. Practically every economist, all the pink papers advised the government not to appeal, to accept the outcome and move on. But the government has appealed. Has it made a mistake? And will this decision to appeal cause concern and perhaps put off some foreign investors?
So I don't know the merits of the case. It's a sub judice matter. I'm sure government has thought about why they need to appeal. But one thing I want to highlight that there was some governance issue in Japan for an automobile company, and they put their global CEO in detention. And the Japanese law process was so low that eventually that CEO had to run out of the country through unfair means. So it's not that we are the only country which is having problems in implementation of law. However, what we need to focus on is to highlight success stories of India. For example, Maruti Suzuki. Maruti makes automobile only for India. It does little bit of export. Suzuki sells worldwide. It owns majority of Maruti. And despite that, Maruti's market cap is higher than Suzuki. These are the kind of success stories which we have to sell. life is not black and white, it's always gray. Sometimes there are shades of gray, sometimes there are shades of white. But at the end of the day, we provide attractive opportunity to many foreign investors. We are the only country in the world where largest telecom company, largest listed bank, largest listed insurance company, largest listed asset management company, largest listed FMCG company are majority owned by foreigners, and they are all successful investments.
Okay. All I want for the sake of the audience, so you referred to, and I won't name him just as you didn't name him, was the CEO of Nissan and Renault. And many people felt that the manner in which the Japanese system was treating him was not fair and proper, because after he escaped from that country and broke bail to do so, no one in the West is actually threatened to send him back to justice. But leave that aside. My last question. There is a lot of coverage, both at home and abroad, about what is called the rising divisiveness in Indian society. We're talking about the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizens, love jihad, cow lynching, what's happened in Kashmir, but perhaps most importantly of all, the way in which Muslims tend to be treated. There are many who say that this atmosphere is undermining the desire to invest. It's holding back investment, both domestic and foreign. Do you believe there's truth in that interpretation?
So, in my interaction with global investors, mainly financials and little less industrial, no one has raised this point. Maybe they don't think it appropriate to raise with people like us, but we haven't heard anyone questioning on this side. More importantly, when we go out as ambassador of India, we truly present India. Our behavior does not necessarily give them any doubt. Our behavior does not give them any doubt whatsoever that we are a truly inclusive society. If I look at my company, we have always selected purely on merit. There's no question of gender. My CIO of fixed income, my head of research is both female, doing excellent job because they are good in doing their work. We have representation from all communities in our office, and they reach that level because they are working, not because they belong to one community. So the example which we can portray in front of our investors give them the confidence that newspapers might be saying one thing, but the reality could be different.
All right, Mr. Shah, thank you very much for explaining in such detail both how you see the state of the economy today, as well as what steps you believe the finance minister should take, and in particular, giving us details of the innovative, imaginative, and creative ways that revenue can be increased without increasing taxation. I know you're a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, but I hope this time they don't just listen to you, they also act on your advice. Thank you very much for talking to me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.